Hello, class. Welcome to week 2 of Old Testament Survey, REL 140. Before we get into the lecture today, I will give you some samples of topics for your paper. So let me open that file. Okay, suggested topics for the Old Testament Survey paper. Choose one of the following topics, one only, to research and write about. And it's actually not required that you choose one of these topics, but you are also free to choose a different topic that relates to the class. These are just suggestions to help you if you're having trouble deciding on a topic. The paper should be 5 to 7 pages long. That includes 1 page for the title page, 3 to 5 pages for the body, and 1 page for the bibliography. The paper must use 6 sources and follow the Turabian style for citations, or to follow it can follow any academic reference style. Turabian is one. There's also Chicago or APA or MLA. So Turabian is one option, as long as it's a recognized academic style for citations. That's fine. Turabian is what I'm most familiar with, so that's what I wrote. But other ones are all right. I'm not aware that the school has a standard or a requirement in that regard, so I'll accept anything. All right, so the papers due the 10th week of class, the end of the term, or since we have only 9 weeks, it's due final week, whatever week that is. So this paper is one of the course requirements. It counts as 20% of your grades. It does not replace the attendance assignment for this week or any other weekly attendance assignments. So don't turn in this and not turn in the regular weekly assignments, because then you won't get credit for the weekly assignment. And so I gave you 10 options. Number 1, what are some of the signs or symbols of God's covenant with humankind? How do they change over the course of the Pentateuch? Pentateuch, again, is the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Number 2, compare and contrasts Moses and David as national and religious leaders of Israel. How are they alike in their responses to those who oppose them, and how are they different? Number 3, discuss some of the characters who experience a reversal of fortune in the Old Testament. What is common or unique about their experiences? What religious ideals does the Old Testament portray in their reversal? So that could be people that started off with good fortune and ended up not so good, or people that had bad things happen to them at first, but then later on things turned out better. There are examples of both you can choose from. Number 4, what are some of the images used in biblical poetry to depict God and humans, or God, humans, and the conflict between good and evil? How do these metaphors continue the themes and motifs of the Old Testament? Number 5, compare and contrast Abraham and his grandson Jacob as patriarchs or fathers of the Hebrew people. In what sense do their experiences foreshadow the struggles of the Israelites? Number 6, compare and contrast the views of creation versus evolution. And if you do that, be sure that you refer especially to the Bible, to the creation accounts in the book of Genesis. Number 7, describe in detail the 10 Commandments. How did these commandments influence later laws of society, such as in the United States or other nations that are influenced by those laws? Number 8, compare God's choosing of Israel as his particular people with his concern for all nations. How are those 2 ideas related, or how do they conflict? Number 9, what does the Old Testament teach about the relationship of God and human beings? And number 10, choose one book or passage of the Old Testament and write a detailed analysis of it. The technical term is exegesis papers. So uh, you'll just choose one book or one small passage and um, probably want to read a few commentaries or books that explain the Bible, and then write your paper to explain the passage and the significance, both for uh, the time it was written as well as lessons you can learn and apply today in today's worlds. All right. So if you have any other questions or if you have any ideas that you want to run by me, feel free to email me. But please don't write just a short paragraph about all 10 of these and then send that in like that's your assignment. That's not what I'm looking for. This is a longer paper that should cover just one topic, and it's due the 10th week. But please go ahead and send me your regular attendance assignments this week and every other week as well. Um, okay, so it's just some ideas. I don't know what kind of research or what kind of library resources you have available. I know my other school has some online resources, and so I go over those with them, but I'm not familiar with what your school has in that regards. But there are definitely online resources. There are also libraries that have physical books you can check out. Um, so if you have questions of what your school has available, contact your school's office. If I knew, again, I would go over those with you, but I'm not familiar with that for your school. All right. So let's close this one, and then we'll begin the lecture. Okay, time for the regular lecture. This again is Old Testament Survey, REL 140, Lecture 2. We covered the book of Genesis last week, so this week we will start with chapter 2 of our textbook, which covers Exodus and Leviticus. The plot is God keeps the promise to have a special relationship with Abraham's heirs by making a covenant with them. God chooses Moses to lead Israel out of Egypt and then uses him to reveal and explain the covenant to the covenant people. At the end of this section, Israel should be ready to conquer the promised land. All right, we'll start with the introduction. Exodus begins with Israel living securely in Egypt. By the book's end, Israel has escaped from slavery in Egypt and moved toward the land God promised Abraham, with Moses as their leader. Most historians place the events of Exodus through Deuteronomy, the second through fifth books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, except for Genesis. Most historians place these events in the era between 1550 through 1200 BC, when Egypt dominated its region. Israel's departure from Egypt occurred no later than 1207 BC, and some scholars believe it was as early as 1446 BC. It is impossible to say with total certainty which date is correct, but in either case, God delivers Israel when Egypt is strong, demonstrating God's great power and love for Israel. Much of Leviticus seems odd to modern readers, with laws about sacrifices, laws about hygiene, sexual practices, festivals, and priestly responsibilities. In light of the events of Exodus, however, the book makes sense. Exodus unfolds the basics of the covenant. Israel, issues of leading, worship, and dealing with sin are addressed in Leviticus. So let's begin the book of Exodus, the first chapters 1 through 4, Israel's enslavement and Moses' call. After the death of Jacob and Joseph, Abraham's heirs multiply in Egypt and become numerous. This makes Egypt nervous, and Pharaoh decides to enslave the Jews. When they continue to increase, Pharaoh attempts to kill all Jewish male babies, but God defeats this plan. For God's promise to be fulfilled, someone will need to lead this great number of people to leave Egypt and return to Canaan. Moses is miraculously saved from death while a baby, since Pharaoh commands all male Israelite babies be drowned. Moses' parents attempt to hide him as long as they can, but when they can no longer do so, Moses' mother puts him in a basket in the Nile River, and his sister Miriam watches him at a distance. Pharaoh's daughter discovers the basket and decides to adopt the boy, and Miriam brings Moses' mother to her as a nurse for the baby. When Moses grows up, he lives with his adoptive mother, but appreciates his heritage. When he sees an Egyptian beating a Jew, he kills the Egyptian. He later tries to reconcile two Jews who are fighting, but they announce the murder that he has committed. Afraid for his life, Moses flees to the desert of Midian, where he marries and has children. The Pharaoh later dies, that's the king of Egypt, but the Israelites remain enslaved under the new Pharaoh and cry out to God. Because of the covenant with Abraham, God will rescue and act on their behalf. He decides to use Moses to deliver them. God appears to Moses in the form of a bush on fire. God speaks to Moses, sending him to command that Pharaoh release the Jews. Moses protests and insists that he is not qualified for the task. God promises to be with Moses and reveals his name as Yahweh, which means I am who I am. God promises to force Pharaoh to release Israel and gives Moses miraculous signs to perform. He also says he will teach Moses what to say and that Moses' brother Aaron will help him speak. Moses reluctantly accepts the commission, and his brother Aaron comes to help him. However, God warns that there will be a long struggle before Pharaoh, whose heart will be hardened, will let Israel leave. Now we turn to Exodus chapters 5 through 19, Israel's Exodus. With their people's support, Moses and Aaron meet Pharaoh, confronting him with the news that Yahweh commands him to let my people go. Pharaoh refuses, even daring to ask, who is Yahweh that I should obey his command? He begins to oppress the Jews even more, forcing them to work harder. God instructs Moses to tell the people they will be set free, but they refuse to listen due to their discouragement. Moses then performs miracles before Pharaoh, such as throwing down his staff, which becomes a snake. Pharaoh's sorcerers perform the same trick, but Moses' snake eats their snakes. Pharaoh is still unimpressed. God then sends 10 plagues against Pharaoh and the Egyptian people, showing Pharaoh that the Lord must be obeyed. Uh, the Lord, it's another name for God. Usually, English Bibles translate the name Yahweh as the Lord. So if you're ever reading an English Bible and you see the word Lord in all capital letters, that's actually the name Yahweh, by the way. So the first of the plagues involves turning the water of the Nile River to blood. The next two involve causing frogs to cover the land and then sending huge swarms of gnats. At first, the Egyptian sorcerers can perform the same signs, but when they can no longer do so, they tell Pharaoh that the plague is from God. However, Pharaoh does not listen. Further plagues include flies filling the land, a plague on the livestock, people being afflicted with boils, hail destroying Egypt's crops, a swarm of locusts eating the rest of the crops and fruit of Egypt, and darkness covering the land. All these plagues affect only Egyptians, not the Israelites. Pharaoh Pharaoh begins attempting to bargain and making promises to free Israel so the plagues will end, only to backtrack on his promises later after the specific plague is over. So ultimately, Pharaoh remains unyielding while God's power has become evident and Moses has become famous. One more awful plague frees Israel. Every firstborn male will die. Israel's children will be spared death when their parents sacrifice a lamb and put blood on the front of their homes, as God will pass over them. The yearly Passover festival will be celebrated as a permanent custom for Israel to remember this deliverance and God's love for them. Egypt's firstborn sons and cattle die during the final plague, causing the nation great grief. Pharaoh finally orders the Jews to leave Egypt. The Jews, who are about 600,000 people, head toward the promised land of Canaan after more than 4 centuries in Egypt. However, Pharaoh makes one more attempt to keep his slaves. As the Israelites approach the Red Sea, Pharaoh's army chases them with 600 chariots, trapping them. When Moses stretches out his hands over the waters, God parts the sea and the people cross over on dry land until they reach the other side. When the Egyptians pursue, the waters return to their place and drown them. These chapters show how Pharaoh and Egypt learned the identity of God who rules over nature and human beings. Israel also sees God's greatness as he acts on their behalf. God redeems Israel, an idea that dominates the rest of the Old Testament. On the desert road, the people begin to complain of hunger. God provides flakes that they make into bread, and the people call it manna. That's a word that means, what is it? Uh, when the people complain of thirst, God has Moses strike a rock, which then produces water. After journeying 3 months, Israel arrives at Mount Sinai. God now prepares the people to receive the covenant and promises to make them a holy nation with priestly duties and representing God to other nations. All right, now we will turn to Exodus chapters 20 through 24, the heart of the covenant. The concept of covenant means commitment, friendship, and binding oath. Covenants were sealed with ceremonies, which involved eating a meal and reciting an oath. More formal covenants were written in a book, which was then kept in a secure place. Covenant breaking was a great offense, often leading to wars or feuds and requiring restitution from unfaithful partners. In Moses' day, a covenant was an absolutely binding relationship in which those who made it were to be totally loyal to one another. All of Israel's neighbors made covenants, but only Israel claimed that their deity or their God made a covenant with them. Only Israel made such an absolute commitment to their God. Exodus 20 through 24 presents the simplest part of the covenant. The Lord delivers the Ten Commandments, foundational standards, which are then applied to daily life through case studies. The Ten Commandments can be divided into two broad categories. The first four focus on Israel's relationship to God, and the last six focus on societal issues and thus relationships with other people. The covenant is based on the identity of the Lord and his past action on the Jews' behalf. His relationship with Israel leads to the standards. The standards do not create the relationship. To have a proper relationship with God, Israel must abide by four principles, including having no gods but Yahweh, refusing to make images of God, honoring his name, and having a special day set aside for rest and honoring God. The final six commands help the people treat one another with respect. These commands include honoring parents, the prohibition of murder, avoiding adultery, outlawing stealing, refusing to give false witness against neighbors, and not coveting or desiring what someone else has, such as a spouse, servants, or possessions. Case laws are given to explain how the Ten Commandments apply to religious and community life, stressing fairness to Yahweh and other people. Various other topics are covered, including the building of altars for Yahweh and good treatment of servants, restitution for injuries or stolen or damaged property. Social concerns also receive treatment, such as the necessity for Israel to take good care of the helpless, widows, orphans, and the poor. A small number of important religious obligations are also mentioned, such as times of Sabbath rest and annual festivals. Yahweh promises to do great things for the people if they obey these standards. Israel agrees, and Moses writes down the commands and case laws to create a record of the covenant agreement. Moses climbs Mount Sinai to receive tablets containing the 10 basic laws. He leaves elders in charge of the people while he remains on the mountain 40 days. Israel is now a covenant people having a special relationship with the Lord. All right, now we turn to Exodus chapters 25 through 31, instructions concerning the tabernacle and the priests. Since Israel needs should be a place to worship God, God tells Moses how to build a portable sanctuary they can take with them wherever they go. The tabernacle houses an ark or a box that will hold the stone tablets containing the Ten Commandments, in addition to other items needed for prayer and sacrifice in the worship center. The tabernacle has three areas: the courtyard, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies, or the most holy place. Priests will be set apart to help the people offer sacrifices and care for the tabernacle and its furnishings. Yahweh instructs Moses to commission two men, Bezalel and Aholiab, to build the tabernacle and its utensils. Next, we have Exodus chapters 32 through 34, covenant breaking and covenant renewal. During Moses' 40-day absence, Moses leaves the people under the leadership of Aaron, his brother. The people fear Moses has died or left them, and they encourage Aaron to make gods for them. Aaron collects gold from the people and makes an idol in the shape of a calf. The people then hold a festival to worship it, complete with drunkenness and immoral behavior. The covenant and commandments are broken. This is obviously not the correct way to worship Yahweh, their God. They've made a false God and behaved in ways that the true God despises. God tells Moses to return to the camp, seeing that the people have become corrupt. As Moses sees what is occurring, he angrily breaks these stone tablets on which the Ten Commandments are written, symbolizing the broken covenant. He then burns the idol. Moses ends the festival, confronting Aaron, who makes excuses, and has 3,000 people put to death in punishment for their sin. He informs the people of their sin and then asks God to forgive them and renew the covenant. As Moses continues to pray for the people, Yahweh gives them a second chance. Moses cuts new covenant stones, and Yahweh pledges to give Israel a homeland if they reject idolatry, keep the laws, and celebrate festivals, the proper festivals that God has designed. All right, then we have the final chapters of Exodus, chapters 35 through 40, building the tabernacle. Israel obeys God, making the most of its second chance. They provide the resources to build the tabernacle. Bezalel and Aholiab build the tabernacle. God's glory fills the worship center. God's love and Moses' leadership have given Israel new life. Israel now has the opportunity to receive the rest of the covenant, such as a way to deal appropriately with their sins. All right, now we turn to the book of Leviticus, chapters 1 through 7, a system for forgiving sins. Israel must offer 5 types of sacrifices, each with its own specific purpose and unique form of presentation. Burnt, sin, and guilt offerings cover the people's sins. A burnt offering is to be given for general sins. Sin offerings are brought when people mistakenly do what is forbidden in any of the Lord's commands. Guilt offerings cover specific sins committed by mistake that harm a neighbor. Grain and peace offerings express gratitude to God. Part of a grain offering is burned. The priests may eat the rest. Peace offerings are animals treated like offerings, offered in hope that God will continue to bless the people, as well as to thank the priests for their work. A set ritual is observed whenever an animal is brought to the tabernacle, including presenting the animal for inspection, placing a hand on its head, which means claiming responsibility for its death, killing the animal, which makes them see the consequences of sin, that sin leads to death, and then blood being sprinkled on the altar by the priest. Several truths can be seen in these chapters. First, God forgives sin. Second, the offerings are specific and personal. Third, the system demonstrates God's fairness, as rich and poor both bring offerings they can afford. Fourth, each of these elements points to God's mercy. All right, let's turn to Leviticus 8 through 10, which is about priests for covenant worship. Priests are mentioned many times in the law sections of Exodus and Leviticus. Aaron serves as the first high priest with clothing that highlights his prominence. The priests are necessary for sacrifice and other aspects of worship. Aaron's sons are to be priests, and the whole tribe of Levi are to be priestly assistants. Moses carries out a symbolic ritual to ordain or set apart the priests. Aaron and his sons then begin their priestly tasks, offering sacrifices and leading worship. Yahweh approves of what they do, with the exception of unauthorized fire offered by two of Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu. Fire comes from the Lord and kills them, which proves the seriousness of God's rules about priestly conduct. Now, we don't know if they're acting in rebellion or if they just make a mistake. It's hard to really understand this passage, but it is very serious to follow God's commands and do exactly what he says. That's the point of what happens, and that's what leads to their deaths. All right, we turn now to Leviticus 11 through 15, which is about clean and unclean. Leviticus then discusses relationships, or then discusses situations and conditions that make a person inappropriate or excused from community life, barring or relieving them from the responsibility of participating in worship. Clean people may participate, unclean people may not. A clean people was one who was ready for daily life and worship. Unclean people were not cleared for contact or daily activity with others, though this did not necessarily mean they were physically or morally dirty. A variety of things could make an individual unclean, including certain foods, skin diseases, mildew, bodily discharges, and childbirth. Uncleanness due to childbirth may be comparable to maternity leave in our society. Lists of animals that are unclean, that are clean and unclean for food are also given, which may have been due to health risks. When the risk is removed and time has come for the people or the person to rejoin the community, the individual may rejoin the community by offering the appropriate sacrifice. While it may seem harsh for diseased people such as lepers to be ostracized from the group, doing so helped the community avoid outbreaks of disease that could kill whole cities of people. So be comparable to our social distancing we've been practicing, especially trying to quarantine people that we know had COVID. So we've done, or we have at least some understanding or familiarity with the practices that they did at that time. Okay, we'll turn to Leviticus 16, the comprehensive sacrifice. Once a year, Aaron, who is the high priest, must offer sacrifices to cleanse the priests of the tabernacle and the people. The God or God will forgive whatever sins have been committed during the previous year. This ritual involves a sin offering to make atonement for himself and his household, slaughtering a goat as a sin offering for the people, ceremonially cleansing the worship area with blood and confessing the people's sins while placing his hands on a live goat. The sins are transferred to the goat that is then taken far into the desert. This Day of Atonement has tremendous symbolic significance. Yahweh's power and love are seen in the comprehensive nature of this ritual, which forgives the people from all types of sins. It also it also reveals Israel's commitment to the covenants as the priest enters the Holy of Holies only on this rare occasion. The goat being taken into the wilderness further shows an accurate picture of how God forgives sins, which are fully pardoned and forgiven once covered. All right, that's where we get our term scapegoat, which means sort of someone who takes the blame, whether they want to or not. But we can also see the goat as a symbol of Jesus, or a symbol of Jesus, who takes all of our sins and becomes the ultimate scapegoat and does so willingly. Now we turn to Leviticus 17 through 26, which is about becoming a holy people. The people also learn how to move towards moral excellence with the holiness code that calls people to be holy because their God is holy. They are to be special or unique and set apart for God's purposes, demonstrating these qualities by the ways they respond to God and treat one another. The laws in the Holiness Code cover practical matters of religious, private, and community life. The heart of the law stresses love for neighbors, and a sustained relationship with God remains the focus of the law. All sacrifices must be brought to the tabernacle in order to prevent the temptation to make offerings to idols. People must also observe these special feasts Yahweh has instituted, which will set them apart as a grateful nation committed to Yahweh. A series of laws also address marital and sexual relationships, prohibiting incest and sexual abuse, adultery, sexual acts and pagan cultic worship, homosexuality, and bestiality. Holiness is the goal of these laws as God sets these standards so that Israel will be different from the nations in Canaan that they will conquer. All the rules are meant to help Israel love their neighbors as much as they love themselves, which involves caring for the poor, practicing honesty, promoting justice, and encouraging purity of worship. Though disobedience would result in discipline, punishment, and death if the people did not repent. And now we turn to Leviticus 27, the final chapter, which covers devotion to Yahweh. The covenant concludes with commands about what belongs to God. The covenant as a whole stresses that the people are devoting themselves to God. The Jews are to give a tenth of their wealth and may pledge to give more out of a vow or joy. Since the land and property come from God, these gifts are not unreasonable. And for the conclusion of Leviticus, Israel now possesses a comprehensive description of what God expects from them. They have the details about worship and standards that guide them in their relationship with God and one another. They also have a national identity as Yahweh's holy people. The covenant prepares them to have a new homeland. And so we turn to chapter 3 of our textbook, which covers the books of Numbers and Deuteronomy and concerns the struggle for land. The plot is Israel comes to the edge of Canaan and then refuses to fight for the land. Because they reject God's promise, Yahweh sentences them to wandering 40 years in the desert. When a new generation matures, the Lord promises them the land. When Deuteronomy ends, the nation is poised on the edge of Canaan, ready to conquer. All right, let's turn to the introduction to this section. Israel must learn how to live as a covenant people in the wilderness with God before they are ready to receive the promise of the land and the security of life. As the people prepare to travel from Sinai toward Canaan, God has the people numbered and the camp set up and purified. God leads them to the border of the land and has them send spies to see the land and set up a strategy to conquer it. The spies return in fear and faithlessness, and the nation's reaction to the bad reports leads to 40 years of divine discipline. Only the next generation will enter the promised land. The old generation wanders and complains through the wilderness into the countries bordering the promised land. God shows his power against their enemies and prepares the people for life in the land. In Deuteronomy, Moses reminds the people of God's opening love, past actions, and expectations for the people in the land. Moses leads the people to renew the covenant with God and then installs Joshua as his successor. He then climbs a mountain to view the promised land before he dies. All right, we'll turn first to Numbers chapter 1 through 10, departure from Sinai. After an eventful year of Israel leaving Egypt, accepting a covenant, and resting near Mount Sinai, they prepare to go conquer Canaan. They first take a census, organize their priests, purify their camp, and dedicate certain people and offerings. Then they ordain the priests and Levites, which means setting them apart for service to God. And they celebrate the Passover and leave Mount Sinai. However, the book's Hebrew title means in the wilderness, in contrast to the English title of the book that refers to the census, numbering the people, that is taken on 2 occasions. This is a warning that something will go wrong. Let's look at Numbers 11 through 20, which concerns losing the land. Tragic events occur in these chapters, moving from the heights of marching to the promised land to the depths of dying in the desert, chronicling disaster and missed opportunity. The people begin to complain about their living conditions in the desert. While the situation may not be pleasant, it is only temporary since they are heading to Canaan. God gives the people quail to eat when they tire of manna and demand meat, though he also sends a plague to punish the people. Miriam and Aaron oppose Moses when he marries an Ethiopian. God defends Moses by striking Miriam with leprosy, but she is healed when Moses prays for her. When they near the promised land, Yahweh has Moses send leaders to spy on the Canaanites, assessing the land, cities, and people. The spies return to report that the land is fruitful, but these cities are heavily fortified and the inhabitants are numerous and powerful. The majority of the spies, with the exception of Caleb and Joshua, counsel against invading the land as Yahweh has instructed them to do. Disappointed, the people wish for death and fear for the lives of their family. They further plan to choose new leaders and return to Egypt. When Moses and Aaron try to convince them to move forward, they consider stoning Moses and Aaron. The Lord responds, denying anyone over 20 years old the right to enter the promised land, with the exception of the two faithful spies, Caleb and Joshua. The other 10 spies die, and the older generation is sentenced to remain in the desert until they die. Realizing their mistake, the people go and fight, despite Moses' warning that it is too late and God will not be with them, and they are defeated in battle. After further instructions on sacrifices are given, a group led by Korah rebels against Moses, opposing Moses' leadership by claiming that God will hear anyone equally. Moses directs that Aaron and these rebels offer fire for the Lord to see who God chooses. God chooses Aaron, the ground opens and swallows Korah, and the other rebels are consumed by fire. After war laws pertaining to priests and purity are given, another tragedy occurs. Once again, Israel complains of thirst. Yahweh tells Moses and Aaron to get water by speaking to a rock. Instead, Moses strikes the rock, even taking partial credit for the miracle instead of honoring God alone. So he says, must we bring water out of this rock for you instead of must God bring water from this rock? So he's sort of including himself in God's action, which dishonors God because it is God's power that does this. Moses is only um, sort of a conduit, but not the one that makes it happen. So Moses takes some credit that is only rightfully God's alone. And because of this prideful insubordination, neither he nor Aaron will enter the promised land, but they will also die in the desert. Aaron dies shortly afterward. While Moses' punishment seems harsh, this episode emphasizes God's holiness and authority. No one can take the Lord's glory, and attempting to do so is to misuse God's name. However, Moses continues to lead Israel and serve God afterward for the rest of his life. All right, we turn now to Numbers 21 through 36, which concerns a new people for the land. The old generation slowly dies over the course of 40 years. Yahweh continues to provide for them in terms of food, clothing, and guidance. They even win some battles. However, they also complain, worship other gods, and participate in immorality. One unusual story involves a pagan prophet named Balaam who hears from the Lord. Uh, so he's not a faithful Jew or not truly a part of Israelite religion. He doesn't fully worship the Lord, but he is sort of a sorcerer for hire. Once we find that out eventually, uh, who can give sort of oracles or prophetic messages in the name of almost any god that uh, is chosen. But he is hired to place a curse on Israel. His donkey then speaks to him to try to turn him aside as he's on the way to do so. And ultimately, he is unable to curse the people, and instead he blesses them. Evident in the story is that Yahweh still plans to fulfill the promises made to Abraham, and nothing can thwart his purpose. Eventually, the old generation dies. God begins to reaffirm various laws and instructions, or instructs Moses to prepare Joshua to be the new leader, in addition to preparing Aaron's son Eleazar to be the new priest. Yahweh allows the Israelites to defeat the Midianites who had enticed them into idolatry. Afterward, the tribe of Gad and Reuben ask, ask Moses to allow their families to settle east of the Jordan River instead of in the Promised Land. Moses agrees after making them promise to help to conquer the land of Canaan. The book concludes with Moses recounting the sad history of Israel's travels in the desert and warns the people to follow the Lord. A discussion of what part of the land each tribe will possess, naming new leaders, an explanation of how the Levites are to be treated, and rules that women may inherit land in cases where there are no male heirs. Though horrible things have happened, a new era is beginning. All right, now we turn to the book of Deuteronomy, chapters 1 through 4, the land and the past. The new generation of Israel, raised in the desert, seems determined to avoid their parents' mistakes, and Moses is determined to prepare them for entry into the land. He advises them on a number of issues, including war, worship, future leaders, and dealing with false prophets. Uh, he presents the nation's past and God's standards as a revised covenant, which he asks them to embrace. Deuteronomy has been described as a treaty between God and Israel, taking its structure from the Hittite vassal treaty common in Moses' day. It begins with an introduction naming the two parties making the agreement, and then describes the history of the relationship, then names general and specific regulations for keeping the covenant, and further notes blessings and curses for keeping or breaking the treaty, followed by a list of witnesses to the agreement. In this way, Deuteronomy summarizes Israel's past and helps shape their future. Moses first reminds the nation of their history. He links the new generation to God's great past and or past acts and to their parents' mistakes to encourage them to keep Yahweh's commands in the future. He reminds them that obedience is the key to their future, just as a weaker nation must obey its stronger covenant partner, so Israel must abide by Yahweh's standards if they are to inherit the land. All right, let's turn to Deuteronomy chapters 5 through 11, basic rules for possessing the land. After completing his brief summary of their past, Moses reviews the basics of the Sinai covenant and establishes the basis of their national life. He tells them to keep the Ten Commandments and other foundational covenant laws, to love God above all else, and that God has chosen them to be a special people. If Israel remembers and responds correctly to these truths, their love for God will lead to a long stay in Canaan. After understanding and implementing the covenant's basic requirements, the new generation can unlock new opportunities for blessing by obeying the more detailed instructions. Now we turn to Deuteronomy chapters 12 through 26, specific rules for possessing the land. Many of these standards explained in these chapters appear earlier in the Pentateuch, but the laws presented here deserve particular emphasis since they are new to this generation. The people also receive some new instructions since they will soon enter a new land. One such instruction is that they must worship Yahweh in one central place, which will guard them against the tendency to worship idols at various local shrines. Other rules apply directly to life in the new land, such as setting aside a few cities as places of refuge for people who have accidentally killed someone, destroying their enemies, rules regarding women taken captive, and giving tithes and offerings to support needy and defenseless people. Two sets of laws about life in Canaan are particularly vital for understanding the rest of the Old Testament. Sensing the people will eventually want a king, Moses sets rules for these rulers. And knowing that there will always be prophets, Moses says a prophet must preach worship of Yahweh alone, and that true prophets will always speak the truth, and thus give predictions that come true. Various rules complete the specific requirements of the covenant, including statements on divorce, the poor and widows, and other issues, laws which combine God's mercy and justice. While the revised covenant has grown more complicated with rules for many situations, it has remained simple in the sense that the Ten Commandments are still its foundation and it remains understandable to all. Let's turn to Deuteronomy chapters 27 through 28, incentives to keep the covenant. Realizing that Israel needs reasons to keep the law, Moses chooses a means of illustration as he encourages them to renew the covenant. Two nearby mountains are pointed to in order to describe Israel's accepting or rejecting the covenant. On one side is the rocky, barren mountain Ebal, which symbolizes what will happen to Israel if they reject God's standards. On the other side is Gerizim, a mountain with trees and vegetation that symbolizes the richness of their lives if they will honor the Lord. Thus, the people may choose barrenness or fruitfulness, death or life, cursing or blessing. By choosing to obey the covenant, Israel will be blessed in every sphere of life. If they refuse the covenant, they will suffer curses that will afflict every area of life, eventually leading to exile from the land. Their future depends on the choices they will make now and in the years ahead. We turn now to Deuteronomy chapters 29 through 33. Accepting the covenant. The nation unanimously accepts this updated covenant, agreeing with Moses and choosing life instead of death. Sensing that the people will eventually rebel and receive the penalties described, Moses tells them that even then, Yahweh will forgive and restore them if they turn back to him. Moses then establishes his aide and military commander Joshua as his successor. He makes a copy of the law to place in the ark as a witness of Israel's pledge to follow Yahweh, and he blesses the people. He reminds the people to take to heart the words of the covenant and command their children to obey the law, which will lead to the people's long life in the land. Their life in and possession of Canaan thus depend on their taking the covenant responsibility seriously. The Great Covenant then comes to an end with the vassal Israel agreeing to serve the Lord and being promised great blessing. If Israel practices covenant faithfulness, they can soon inherit the promised land. All right, finally, here we have Deuteronomy 34, the last chapter of Deuteronomy, which is about the death of Moses. After addressing the people and encouraging Joshua, Moses climbs Mount Nebo, where he views Canaan from a distance, and then he dies. No person impacts Old Testament faith like Moses. With Moses, the people survive as a nation and develop from a slave people to a conquering army. Despite his flaws, Moses' blend of boldness and humility make him a model servant of Yahweh. And here we have the conclusion in this section. At the end of the Pentateuch, Israel is outside Canaan, ready to possess their new home. God has advanced his plan to overcome human sin by choosing a holy nation. The promises made to Abraham are either filled or near completion, with a new generation in place that has received the covenant and will soon gain the land. And this leads us to part 2 of our textbook, which is the second part of the Hebrew Bible, the former prophets, or the prophets, but we'll start with the former prophets. Let's turn to the introduction. Deuteronomy leaves readers in suspense. Israel is just outside the promised land, ready to complete God's promises to Abraham, with God having promised to fight for them and Moses having said they would succeed. However, Israel's chances for success do not seem strong. Since Canaan has several fortified cities with large populations, and Israel has limited combat experience. In addition, Israel has never governed themselves. The books of Joshua through Kings address these issues, telling what happened in history and explaining why it happened. They report events and name the theological factors involved in Israel's history. They feature human heroes and villains while also pointing to the Lord of history. The books present a sacred history of Israel, taking seriously both the human and divine elements of history. The biblical writers judged Israel's leaders and people by the covenant principles in Deuteronomy. Joshua through Kings, the next few books of the Bible, have even been called a Deuteronomistic history, this emphasis on the covenant makes these narratives prophetic literature. The prophets in these books and the later prophets of Isaiah through Malachi proclaim Yahweh as the only God and call Israel and the world to faith in him. As we read the former prophets, we will see if Israel will measure up to its covenant responsibilities and to find out how God will react. First, we will see how the second generation will capture the land. So we turn to chapter 4. Joshua gives the land. The plot is Joshua leads Israel's conquest of Canaan. Israel divides the land and chooses to live as a covenant community within their inherited country. We'll start with the introduction. Joshua is an exciting and positive book. Israel finally conquers the land God promised to Abraham, accomplishing this task because they are determined to obey the Lord. Joshua has three parts. First, Israel conquers most of the land. Second, the land is divided among the nation's 12 tribes. And finally, the book concludes with a covenant renewal ceremony. Each section focuses on Yahweh's faithfulness in offering Canaan to Israel and on Israel's challenge to respond in faithfulness. Let's start with Joshua chapters 1 through 12, the promised land conquered. God has chosen Joshua, who is Moses' assistant, to be the capable leader Israel will need to conquer the land. However, he still has to prove his ability to replace Moses. Because of his awesome responsibility, Joshua needs encouragement from Yahweh before Israel enters the land. God promises never to leave him or forsake him, to give the promised land to the people, and to make Joshua great. Joshua must lead the people, keep the covenant, read and obey the law of Moses, and depend on God's presence. Joshua decides to attack Jericho first, and thus to divide Canaan into two parts, as Jericho is in the middle of the region. Israel would then have a central base from which to move north and south. So he sends two spies to view the city. The spies enter the house of a prostitute named Rahab, who hides them when the king's messengers come to arrest them. Rahab later confesses to the spies that she believes God will give Jericho to Israel and asks the spies to spare her and her family when they destroy the town. They agree, and she helps them escape. She will become part of the people of God through her faith and actions. The people cross the Jordan River with priests carrying the ark in front to symbolize Yahweh's leadership of the people, and the river stops flowing while they cross. Jericho falls in a spectacular manner. For 6 days, the people march around it without attacking. On the seventh day, Yahweh gives them the city during their march by causing the walls to collapse. Rahab is spared, and Joshua's fame spreads. Joshua orders that all the wealth be put in the Lord's treasure, and no spoils of war be kept by individuals. However, a man named Achan disobeys this command, taking some gold, silver, and clothing. When Israel tries to capture the city of Ai next, the people do not succeed at first. When Joshua asks Yahweh why they have been defeated, Yahweh directs him to Achan, or they cast lots, and eventually the lot falls to Achan, who then confesses his disobedience and is given the death penalty. After he is dead, then Israel then successfully conquers Ai. . That shows how sin impacts not only individuals but also communities. Many cities unite to fight against Israel. However, the Gibeonites who live nearby develop a plan to fool the Israelites into thinking they are a distant nation, approaching Israel wearing old clothing and carrying moldy bread, claiming to have come from afar in order to serve Yahweh. Joshua makes an alliance with them without asking God first. Israel later discovers this error, but is then bound by oath not to destroy Gibeon. Instead, Israel makes the Gibeonites their servants. Several kings then march against Gibeon because of its treaty with Israel. When the Gibeonites ask Israel for help, Joshua takes the opportunity to defeat several armies at once, and God even makes the sun stand still so Israel's enemies cannot flee by night. Joshua now moves south and north. He takes southern towns, including Lachidah, Libnah, Lachish, Eglon, Hebron, and Debir. Joshua then attacks in the north, taking major places such as Hazor. After defeating another group of nations that joined to fight Israel, Joshua soon has control of the region's biggest cities and has completed most of the conquest. The prominent population centers. Joshua simply carries out what Moses commanded, and the victories fulfill God's earlier promises. The people are faithful to the covenant and receive the promised land and the rest that comes with it. Let's turn now to Joshua chapters 13 through 22, the promised land divided. All the major military centers have now fallen to the Israelites, and Canaan's power bases no longer exist. Israel now has only to defeat all the smaller towns and settle in their proper places. The most difficult task is over, but a new challenge has arisen. Joshua and the priest Eleazar divide the land among the tribes and tell them to displace the remaining Canaanites. The tribes who have land beyond the Jordan are also allowed to go home. Caleb, the other faithful spy who suffered through the 40 years of wandering in the desert, despite his desire to invade the land earlier, conquers Hebron to earn his inheritance at 85 years of age, a high point in the story. And now we have Joshua chapters 23 through 24, renewing the covenant. Joshua leads Israel in one last covenant renewal ceremony. He encourages the leaders, telling them they will inherit the land if they obey God's law, for God will continue to fight for them. He retells the national story, beginning with Abraham's father Terah and describing how Israel went from serving other gods to serving Yahweh and continuing through Israel's journey from slavery in Egypt to freedom and prosperity in Canaan. Joshua then challenges the people to serve Yahweh in the present and future, setting an example by stating that he and his family will serve the Lord. The people praise God and agree to keep the covenant, realizing that the Lord has given them the land. Joshua warns them of the difficulty involved in serving God and that rebellion will cause them to be punished. But the people persist in stating that they will serve the Lord. So Joshua writes the covenant in the book of the law. When Joshua dies, he is buried in the land his family has inherited. The leaders who succeed Joshua continue to help the people follow Yahweh. All right, in conclusion, like Moses, Joshua is an extraordinary individual, both warrior and spiritual leader. He overcomes fears to win great victories. He constantly praises the Lord and honors Moses' memory. Joshua is able to raise Israel to new national greatness, fulfilling God's promise of land for Israel that it can keep as long as the people obey the Lord. Okay, for the biblical text this week, I have given you Exodus chapter 3. Uh, I usually choose the New International Version. Um, and if you don't have a Bible, you can find this at the Bible Gateway website. This is the link here. You can click on or just look up Bible Gateway. And once you get to that website, look up Exodus 3. Uh, this is about Moses and the burning bush. So I'll just scroll through this. I'm not going to read this aloud, but I'll scroll through it slowly. So maybe you can read it. But if this is too fast, again, just go to the website or look this up in a Bible. Exodus chapter 3, starting with verse 1. This is when God calls Moses to lead his people from Egypt. Back to the okay. For the regular attendance assignments, it's the same question every week. I just ask you to write 1 to 2 paragraphs or 1 page maximum to answer this question. What is the main idea you took from this week's lecture? So uh, make sure that you are referring to specific things we talked about in class. Uh, don't just talk about general Christian beliefs. I mean, it's good that you know general Christian beliefs, but I want to see specifically that you have watched this lesson, this lecture, or kept up with this lesson. So I want to see something specific from this lesson that you refer to. Uh, and then don't please keep it under 1 page. I think I've had former students that just copy and paste a whole Wikipedia article. It's 5 pages long. That's not what I'm looking for. I want to see this in your own words and keep it kind of short and succinct. You don't have to cover everything from the lecture, but just some, maybe even just one main point or a few things. But please keep it under 1 page. And then for the extra credit, if you want the extra credit points, then write another 1 to 2 paragraphs or 1 page maximum based on the reading from Exodus 3. So read Exodus 3 and answer these questions. What do you think of Moses as God first calls him? What strengths and weaknesses does he appear to have? Does he seem to be a likely deliverer for the people of Israel? Why or why not? And what do you think of Moses as you reflect on his entire life that we've seen in this lesson? You don't have to read the full passages in the Bible, but just based on what we've talked about in the lesson, or you might want to read the last chapter of Deuteronomy for extra help if you need extra help to answer this. And how has he been a foundational figure for the Old Testament, the Jewish people, and Christianity? He is obviously an important person in this regard, and he's still honored by both the Jewish people and Christians as being foundational for our faiths. And he is sort of a very important person in the Old Testament, especially. So answer these questions. And if you want the extra credit, but if you don't, then just the first part of the assignments is sufficient to give you credit for attendance. And then email this to me the next week or so, and I'll respond to you as soon as I can. So just to point out where we are, this is our second week, and I plan to have the midterm tests 3 weeks, I think, either 2 or 3, but I think it's 3. I'll find out for sure and prepare you for that beforehand. You can check the syllabus, which I don't have with me right now. That tells you the exact dates of the midterm and all the other important dates for the class. And I think we do have one more holiday sometime in February for President's Day. I don't have those exact dates, but it's on the syllabus. So please send me your assignment if you have any questions. Feel free to contact me. If you would like a copy of the notes for this lesson or any lesson, you can always ask. Or if you want a copy of the suggestions I've given you for the research paper, you can ask for those, and I'll send those to you as well. Hope you all have a good week. We will see you next week. Take care and God bless.